March 7th, 1945. American soldiers from the 9th Armored Division stared across the Rhine at Remagen, watching German engineers scramble around the Ludendorff Bridge with explosive charges. The bridge should have been rubble already. Every other crossing for hundreds of kilometers had been destroyed on Hitler's direct orders. But something had gone wrong with the demolition, and now Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led his men in a desperate sprint across the railroad bridge while German bullets pinged off the steel girders and the wooden plankings shuddered under their boots. 300 kilometers to the southeast, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was studying maps. The Rhine River traced a thick blue line across the paper, the last natural barrier between the Allied armies and the heart of Germany. He had declared it would be held. Every bridge destroyed, every crossing contested, the river itself transformed into an impassable moat defended by armies that existed now, mainly in his imagination. The telephone call came through that evening. American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact. They were across the Rhine. Hitler's hand, already trembling from what his doctors believed was Parkinson's disease, shook more violently as he gripped the edge of the map table. His face, pale and puffy from months of living underground, flushed red. The officers present that night would later describe the fury that erupted from him, a volcanic rage directed at subordinates who had failed to destroy a single bridge, who had allowed the impossible to happen. Who was responsible? Hitler demanded. Who allowed this? The answer came in fragments over the following hours as reports filtered back to Berlin. Major Hans Scheller, the officer responsible for bridge demolitions in the area. Major Herbert Strobel, the local combat commander. Captain Willy Bratke, who commanded the defense. Lieutenant Karl Peters, the engineer officer. Hitler wanted them all. Immediately. Court-martial, Hitler ordered. Execute them, all of them. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, stood nearby, his face carefully neutral. He had learned over the years that contradicting Hitler in these moments was pointless. The Führer would calm eventually, or he wouldn't, but arguing only intensified his rage. The bridge should have been destroyed, Hitler continued, his voice rising. I gave explicit orders. Every bridge, every crossing. They had one task, one simple task. What Hitler didn't say, what he perhaps couldn't allow himself to acknowledge, was that the capture of the Remagen Bridge wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a symbol of something larger, something that had been building for months, but which he had refused to see. The Wehrmacht, the once mighty German military machine that had conquered most of Europe, no longer existed as an effective fighting force. The armies he commanded were increasingly phantom formations, units that existed on paper and in his mind, but which had been ground down to scattered remnants by years of brutal combat on two fronts. By March of 1945, Germany's strategic situation had become catastrophic. In the east, Soviet forces had driven across Poland and were preparing for their final assault on Berlin. In the west, American, British, and Canadian armies had pushed through the Siegfried Line and stood at the Rhine, the last major obstacle before the industrial heartland of the Ruhr and the open plains beyond. Hitler's insistence that every inch of ground be held, that no retreat was permissible under any circumstances, had destroyed the flexibility that might have allowed the Wehrmacht to establish coherent defensive lines. The officers Hitler blamed for Remagen were arrested within days. The court-martial was a formality. 3 of them, Scheller, Strobel, and Peters, were executed by firing squad on Hitler's orders. The 4th, Bratke, would survive the war in captivity, his death sentence not carried out before Germany's collapse. But executing 4 officers didn't change the situation at Remagen. By March 10th, the Americans had established a bridgehead 6 kilometers deep and 15 kilometers wide on the Rhine's eastern bank. German counterattacks, ordered by Hitler despite the lack of resources to carry them out effectively, failed to dislodge them. The Ludendorff Bridge itself collapsed on March 17th, its structure fatally weakened by German artillery fire and the hasty repairs the Americans had made. But by then, the Americans had built several pontoon bridges, and the bridgehead was secure. Hitler's response to the Remagen disaster revealed the fundamental disconnect between his perception and reality. In his daily military conferences, held in the bunker's map room, he continued to issue orders as if commanding armies that still possessed the strength and mobility of 1940. He would point to positions on the map and declare that this unit would attack here, that division would hold there, seemingly unaware that many of these formations existed only as skeleton crews with obsolete equipment and inadequate supplies. General Heinz Guderian, the chief of the Army General Staff, had been trying for months to make Hitler understand the true situation. In mid-March, as the Rhine crisis unfolded, Guderian presented Hitler with detailed reports on the actual strength of German forces in the West. The numbers were devastating. Divisions that were supposed to have 15,000 men had 3,000. Tank units that should have fielded 200 panzers had 20. Artillery batteries were out of ammunition. Fuel shortages meant that even when vehicles were available, they often couldn't move. Hitler's response was to accuse Guderian of defeatism. "You're always bringing me bad news," Hitler said during one particularly heated exchange. "Where are the victories? Where are the counterattacks I ordered?" "Mein Führer," Guderian replied, his frustration barely controlled. "I can only report the situation as it exists. The forces required for these operations simply don't exist." Hitler turned away from him, back to the maps. "Then we will create them, call up more men, move divisions from the east." "There are no divisions to move," Guderian said. "The Eastern Front is barely holding as it is. If we weaken it further—" "The East will hold," Hitler interrupted. "It must hold, and the West will hold. The Rhine will be held." But the Rhine wasn't being held. Even as Hitler insisted on impossible defensive lines, the Allied advance continued. On March 22nd, General George Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, south of Mainz, achieving complete surprise. Patton, never one for modesty, allegedly called his superior, Omar Bradley, to gleefully announce that he had crossed the Rhine before Montgomery, whose massive set-piece crossing operation was scheduled for the following day. Montgomery's Operation Plunder began on the night of March 23rd. It was the largest river-crossing operation since D-Day, involving over 1 million men, thousands of artillery pieces, and massive air support. The scale of the operation was meant to be overwhelming, to smash through any German resistance by sheer weight of force. And it succeeded. By March 24th, British and Canadian forces had established solid bridgeheads and were pushing inland. In the bunker in Berlin, Hitler received these reports with a strange mixture of rage and detachment. Albert Speer, his Minister of Armaments and War Production, visited him around this time and was shocked by what he saw. Hitler had aged dramatically. His left hand trembled constantly. He walked with a shuffle, dragging his left leg. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, had become dull and unfocused. He would sit for hours studying the maps, moving colored pins that represented army groups and divisions, many of which no longer existed in any meaningful sense. "We will counterattack," Hitler told Speer during one of these visits. "The Americans are overextended. We'll cut them off, drive them back across the Rhine." Speer, who had been traveling throughout Germany and had seen firsthand the devastation and the collapse of German military power, tried gently to suggest that such counterattacks were impossible. Hitler's response was to launch into a monologue about Frederick the Great, who had faced impossible odds during the 7 Years' War and had ultimately triumphed because he refused to surrender. "History will repeat itself," Hitler said. "Our enemies will fall apart. Their alliance will collapse. We just need to hold on." It was around this time, on March 19th, that Hitler issued what became known as the Nero Decree, officially titled the Demolitions on Reich Territory Decree. The order was explicit and comprehensive. All military, industrial, transportation, and communications facilities within Germany were to be destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Bridges, factories, power plants, food supplies, everything that might be useful to the advancing Allies was to be demolished. The decree revealed something fundamental about Hitler's state of mind in late March of 1945. He was no longer thinking about defending Germany or preserving German lives. He was thinking about destruction, about ensuring that if he couldn't have victory, then Germany itself would be obliterated. The decree contained a chilling logic. If the German people couldn't win the war, they didn't deserve to survive. Albert Speer, appalled by the order, began quietly sabotaging its implementation. He traveled throughout Germany, telling local officials and military commanders to ignore the decree, to preserve infrastructure that would be needed for Germany's survival after the war. It was an act of extraordinary courage, direct defiance of Hitler's orders at a time when such defiance could result in immediate execution. But Hitler, increasingly isolated in his bunker, seemed unaware that his orders were being ignored. He continued to issue directives, to plan counterattacks, to move phantom divisions on his maps. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had replaced Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West on March 10th, tried to manage the impossible situation by conducting a fighting retreat, giving ground slowly while trying to preserve what remained of his forces. But Hitler's orders forbade retreat. Every position was to be held to the last man. The disconnect between Hitler's bunker and reality had become total. In the map room, colored pins showed German armies holding strong defensive lines. In the actual field, scattered units were being encircled and destroyed. Soldiers were surrendering in massive numbers, and the front was disintegrating. When subordinates tried to explain this to Hitler, he accused them of cowardice or treason. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Operations Staff of the Armed Forces High Command, had the unenviable task of presenting the daily military situation to Hitler. By late March, these briefings had become surreal exercises in denial. Jodl would report the loss of another city, the collapse of another defensive line, the surrender of another division. Hitler would respond by ordering counterattacks, by units that didn't exist, or by insisting that the reports were exaggerated, or by blaming the officers in the field for failing to follow his orders. "The troops aren't fighting hard enough," Hitler said during one briefing. "They lack the will, they lack the belief in final victory." Jodl, a career officer who had served Hitler loyally throughout the war, finally allowed himself a moment of honesty. "Mein Führer, the troops are fighting as hard as they can with what they have, but they're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of supplies. No amount of will can overcome these material facts." Hitler's face darkened. Material facts can be overcome by superior will. That has always been the key to victory. The enemy's material superiority means nothing if we refuse to surrender. But the enemy's material superiority meant everything. By the end of March, Allied forces had established multiple bridgeheads across the Rhine and were beginning to break out into Germany's interior. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, was being encircled. Army Group B, with over 300,000 men, was trapped in a pocket that was steadily shrinking. Hitler ordered them to hold, to tie down Allied forces, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they were forced to surrender. What Hitler said when he realized his armies couldn't hold the Rhine wasn't a single dramatic statement or a moment of clear recognition. It was a gradual descent into delusion spread across weeks of denial, rage, and increasingly disconnected orders. He never truly accepted that the Rhine had been lost, just as he never truly accepted that the war was lost. Instead, he retreated further into fantasy, into a world where victory was still possible if only his subordinates would follow his orders, if only the German people would show sufficient will, if only history would repeat the miraculous turnarounds of the past. In early April, as Allied armies drove deeper into Germany, Hitler's daily routine had become almost ritualistic. He would wake in the afternoon, attend the military briefing where he would issue impossible orders, eat a meager meal, and then spend hours studying the maps, moving the colored pins that represented armies that no longer existed. His staff had learned to simply agree with him, to acknowledge his orders, and then quietly do whatever was actually possible. The few visitors from the outside world who saw him during this period were shocked by his deterioration. He looked, one officer said, like a man who had aged 30 years in 6 months. His uniform hung loosely on his frame. His hands shook constantly. He shuffled rather than walked. But his eyes, when they focused, still burned with the same intensity, the same absolute certainty that his will would ultimately prevail. The tragedy of Hitler's final months wasn't just personal, it was national. His refusal to face reality, his insistence on fighting to the last man and destroying everything in the process, condemned Germany to weeks of additional suffering that served no military purpose. Cities that could have been spared were fought over until they were rubble. Soldiers who could have survived died in pointless last stands. Civilians who could have been evacuated were caught in the final battles. The Rhine, that thick blue line on Hitler's maps, had been the last real defensive barrier. Once it was crossed, once the Allies were established on the eastern bank with overwhelming force, the war's outcome was inevitable. But Hitler couldn't accept inevitability. He had built his entire political career on the idea that will could overcome any obstacle, that belief and determination were more important than material reality. To accept that the Rhine couldn't be held was to accept that his entire world view was wrong. So he didn't accept it. He blamed his generals for cowardice, his soldiers for insufficient will, his enemies for using overwhelming force rather than fighting honorably. He issued orders for counterattacks that couldn't be executed, for defensive lines that couldn't be manned, for victories that couldn't be achieved. And when reality continued to contradict his orders, he retreated further into the bunker, further into the maps, further into the fantasy where the colored pins represented real armies and where the next counterattack would turn the tide. By mid-April, Soviet forces were fighting in the suburbs of Berlin. Americans and British forces had driven hundreds of kilometers beyond the Rhine and were meeting Soviet troops along the Elbe River. Germany was cut in half, its armies destroyed or captured, its cities in ruins. And in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler was still studying his maps, still issuing orders, still insisting that victory was possible. What he said when he realized his armies couldn't hold the Rhine was in the end, nothing. Because he never truly realized it. He never allowed himself that moment of recognition, that acceptance of defeat. Instead, he maintained the delusion until the very end, until Soviet shells were falling on the chancellery above him, until the bunker itself was shaking from the impacts. Even then, in his final hours, he was issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, planning counterattacks that would never happen, believing in a victory that had become impossible months before. The fall of the Rhine wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment when the gap between Hitler's perception and reality became unbridgeable, when the fantasy world he had constructed in the bunker completely separated from the actual war being fought above ground. His response to that moment, his inability to accept what had happened, defined the final tragic weeks of the Third Reich and ensured that Germany's defeat would be as catastrophic and complete as possible.